We're going to be talking about asset management specifically and the new regulations that have come into place in Connecticut. So we're going to start out by hearing from Connecticut Public Health, Department of Public Health, and have them discuss the regulations and how they came to be. And then the rest of the webinar will talk about what asset management is all about and why you might want to do it. Even if there were no regulations, why it's a good thing for your utility. This is the first in a series of webinars. So today is webinar 1, but there's a series of webinars for small drinking water systems in Connecticut that will go through financial issues and other topics. So there'll be 4 altogether. Today is webinar 1, 3 more in the new year. So please join us for all the webinars. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Lori Matthew from the state of Connecticut, the Department of Public Health, and she will help us understand sort of the backstory. What's the story behind the regulations? Why did Connecticut want to do this? And what prompted the regulations to come into being? So Lori, why don't you take it away? Oh, and just one quick thing before Lori speaks is if you have a question about Lori's presentation, Lori's discussion about the regulations, please go ahead and type it into the question dialog box. If it's very specific about the regulations, we may answer a few of those at the beginning. Other questions, go ahead and put them in the dialog box, and we will get to those at the end of the webinar. So with that, go ahead, Lori.
Heather, thank you so very much, and Tess, thank you. From the State of Connecticut Department of Public Health. Again, my name is Lori Matthew. I'm the Section Chief of the Drinking Water Section at the State of Connecticut Department of Public Health here in Hartford. I want to thank the Environmental Finance Center for conducting this webinar, as well as the next 3 that are coming up in this series. Without your assistance here in Connecticut, we wouldn't be able to hold this training, and we really very much appreciate all of your work in working with us. Some of you out there and attending this webinar today may not know who the Environmental Finance Center is, and I'm glad that Heather and Tess explained who they are and where they are. And they are a group that represents many groups, as you saw in the previous slide, that they work across the country and have for many years. And maybe Heather could tell us at some point how many years you've been working on asset management from the Environmental Finance Center network. But for many years, our State of Connecticut Department of Public Health has worked with Heather specifically on a variety of issues that concern small public water systems and providing direct technical assistance to small public water systems in our state. The Department of Public Health, just to step back a little bit, has primacy over the Safe Drinking Water Act. Our program under the Commissioner of Health has been around since the early 1900s. The laws that regulate water companies and public water systems have been around a long time, but I want to speak to you today about a new requirement, and a requirement that the Department of Public Health, along with legislators, work together to craft a new requirement, a very specific requirement that essentially 2 years from now, in the year 2021, in January of 2021, small public water systems, small community public water systems that serve essentially under 1,000 people will have to produce a fiscal and asset management plan. That is a new statutory requirement that passed this past legislative session and was signed into law by Governor Malloy in May of this year. This new requirement is something that the health department believes is fundamental to running a public water system moving forward. One of the reasons why we moved this forward in working with legislators over the last couple of years on this law was the outcome of the storms back in 2011 and 2012. In particular, Storm Sandy, if you recall, back in October of 2012, hit the state of Connecticut. It was Hurricane Category 1, hit the state of Connecticut fairly hard. And it affected our small public water systems in a very negative way. We had over 100 boil water advisories. And as you know, if you've ever gone through a boil water advisory, you know what we're talking about. Many small systems were out of water for 5 to 10 days. And returning to water service after a hurricane is not an easy practice. And I will tell you that the governor's office came to us after not only Storm Sandy, but the tropical storm Irene and the freak snowstorm Alfred that we had that came before that. After those three storms, we had many, many water systems that we thought were very in need of financial assistance, in need of resiliency assistance, and just in general needed help on what it meant to be a sustainable public water system for the future. We've heard from many owners of small community systems that they want to maintain their water system. They want to own it. They want to operate it. They don't want to be taken over by a larger system. They don't want to lose control of their water systems. So in talking with the owners, we believe that fundamentally there's a need to produce a plan of your assets, a basic plan. We're not asking for a large, very expensive plan. What you'll hear from Heather today is that, you know, by going through some steps and sitting back and thinking through the makeup of your water system and writing this down and having a good asset management tracking sheet of what you own as a public water system and how old is it, how aged is it, what's the general condition. You could look back at our sanitary surveys that our engineers conduct every 3 years. We could be of assistance in providing some basic information from our data files that would help inform your asset management plan. Your asset management plan that can get put together, and also you can start to look at your financing. How much money do you have? Have you set aside any money? Do you have an accounting of how much you will need in the future to potentially upgrade your system? Is your system so aged that you need hundreds of thousands of dollars to meet new requirements or to just fix your aged system? We are running into many of these small community systems that need hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment to fix a tank, to fix your new pumps, or drill more wells, or purchase additional land, or to be able to fix all the leaks, or find the leaks that you might have, or replace some of the water mains. Many of the small systems have struggled with the financial side of this. And so, and we don't want to have these water systems run into a problem where they want to hold on to their water system, they're desperate to hold on to their water system, but they haven't looked at what it would take to do that. This asset management plan and fiscal planning will fundamentally be able to show small system owners what it will take to maintain a water system and be sustainable for the future. And we didn't mean this requirement to be something that you're just going to draft up and send to the state. We really want this plan to be your plan. We want you as owners and responsible parties of water systems to sit back and use this time, this next 2 years of time, to take a careful look at what it takes to be a sustainable water system. And some water systems are very good. Some water systems have come to us and said, you know, we have put money aside, we have an account, but we don't quite know how to spend it. What is most important for us to spend our money on? This asset planning exercise and plan development can help you through that thought process. Some water systems have no money set aside, and they have no money to pay for new requirements or even the basic testing requirements. And then again, there's some systems, like the system I received an email from over the weekend that said, we want out. We do not want to run this water system anymore. We are not sustainable, and nobody wants to be on the board to run this water system. So there is a process for that in the state of Connecticut. It's known as a takeover process. But we prefer if you, as an owner of a water system, want to maintain that ownership and be sustainable for the future, plus be resilient for the future. I brought up the storms for good reason. Our governor's office came to us after Sandy and said, you, health department, have to do better. You have to help these water systems in the business of being a public water supply. So we worked together on training and efforts with other groups to help plans to be produced, and we thought carefully and long about what we thought was necessary to move forward. So this requirement that I'm referring to is also a subject of a circular letter that we sent out, and hopefully you all have it. That's on my slide. It's known as Circular Letter 2018-21. And you'll see the details there. You could look up the law. There's links to the law if you want to see the actual language. But essentially, by January 1 of 2021, each small community water system that serves under 1,000 people is to prepare a fiscal and asset management plan for the system's capital assets, and is to be kept up to date annually. Again, that is not something that you're to produce for the state of Connecticut. It is your plan, and we see it as that. So with that, I could go on, but I won't. I'll stop there. And Heather, I want to turn it over to you. And again, thank you to the Environmental Finance Center Network. We really appreciate all of your work and you bringing this webinar to the state of Connecticut for our benefit. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we have one question, I guess, that's come in already. So Tess, is there a question that should be answered before we move on?
Yeah, we could we just have one question, and the question is, are there any options for systems that might struggle with the cost of asset management?
As far as financial assistance from the state of Connecticut, we have a drinking water state revolving loan fund, and that is a loan that comes out of the drinking water section. It's essentially 2% over 20-year payback, and there's a small bit of a subsidy, and that's one of the opportunities for financing if a small system struggles with aging infrastructure or replacing tanks or what have you.
Great.
Great. All right, so I think we're ready to move on, and thank you very much, Lori, for sharing that information. That was very informative to start us off today. And just a reminder, my name is Heather Himmelberger. I'm the director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. And although I'm located in New Mexico currently, working at the University of New Mexico, I am transplanted from back east, not quite as far east as you all, but I grew up in Pennsylvania. And I spent quite a bit of time in the northeastern part of the country before moving out here. I'm an engineer by training, but I say I'm operations, management, and finance by choice because that's the part I really like. I really like working with water utilities and helping with managerial and financial issues and digging into how you're able to operate, maintain, manage your water utilities. Been working with the EFC for about 24 years now, and doing asset management for about 15 or 16 years. So a long time, done hundreds of these different kinds of asset management trainings and workshops. I've kind of lost track after a couple hundred. So it's a big part of what I do. And it's a program that I really like and feel very passionate about. So starting off, I'll say that for most of you, very small utilities, drinking water service may not be your main activity, but rather just a small part of what you do. You may have another business that you're trying to run. Perhaps it's running an apartment complex or something like that, and you're providing the water for that apartment complex, but the water's not your main activity. It's just a part of your activity of running that utility, of running that overall business. So because of that, water can sometimes fade into the background. So what goes into your water utility, the things that you have to do on a day-to-day basis, may not be things that you think about a lot. As long as the faucets are running and your customers have water, you may not really think about that any deeper than that. But for many reasons, you really want the water utility to become a significant focus of what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it. There are many reasons for that. One is really public health. Especially now in the news, we're seeing a lot more information about the types of things that might affect public health. So there might be problems with the infrastructure, for example, with the issues of lead. Lead is much more of an issue of infrastructure than it is your source water. Typically, lead is not in the source water. It gets into the water through service lines or leaded solder or something like that. It could even be things like, bacteria getting into your system. It could be something that enters your system through groundwater or surface water. So public health is a reason that we need to care about our utilities. Getting regulatory compliance is another issue. And smaller utilities have to meet pretty much the same requirements as larger utilities. So it's very difficult for them to have the money. Somebody just mentioned having enough money to, deal with the asset management requirements. Well, you don't just have asset management, you have a lot of other things you have to do. And it can be very expensive to comply with all the testing requirements and that sort of thing that you have to do, and particularly difficult for small utilities. And you see a map of the country, basically, total violations per community, and many of those are really rural, small water utilities that are struggling to meet the requirements. Another aspect is public and employee safety. This is a picture that actually took place in Connecticut of a hydropneumatic tank that exploded. This was infrastructure that was not properly maintained. It had an explosion. Thankfully, nobody was injured in that explosion, but if somebody had been there in the building at that time, that could have been a very, very terrible accident. So we want to make sure that our public employees, our public and our employees are protected and that their health and safety is not put at risk. And we're going to talk more about hydropneumatic tanks in webinar 4. So stay tuned for a little bit more information about that. Another thing is reliability of service. People always expect water to be there anytime they turn on their tap. They expect the water to actually run and to be there. So reliability is a big issue. And then resiliency, which actually has a couple of components. One is resiliency to emergencies. And Lori mentioned a couple of recent examples where you've had some hurricanes and some floodwaters that have occurred. But there are other kinds of emergencies. There could be fires. There could be power outages. There's all kinds of things that could happen. And you need to be resilient to those so that you can still provide service to your customers, even in the face of some of these emergencies. Another resiliency is financial. How resilient are you to potential financial problems? So having enough money to make repairs, having enough money to do your maintenance, having enough money to replace assets when they have reached the end of their useful life. So having financial resiliency is also important. We really would like to see businesses run or water utilities run a little bit more like a business, because that will help you address, all the concerns we just discussed, as well as meeting the regulations. And that's not like a business in the sense that we're trying to make a profit, but like a business in the sense that we're trying to meet customer expectations, because most businesses are about providing the service that their customers want. You don't remain in business very long if you put out a product that isn't what your customers are after. So this is kind of the same thing. We're putting out a product. We want our public to like the product, accept the product, and pay for the product. So we want to run like a business in that sense. So what does all this entail? Doing asset management, running like a business, what's involved in that? So the first part is really thinking about what assets do you own? What do you have? And what do you need to know about them? So each asset that makes up your system, what information would I want to know about my assets? Then what do I want my assets to do in order to provide my customers what they want? So I have customers. What is it that my customers actually want? When I get an emergency phone call, somebody's called something in, they're contacting me about my water utility. What are the assets or asset that you're hoping they don't say? So what is that thing that, oh my gosh, if that really goes bad, for example, that utility that the hydropneumatic tank exploded, that would be one of those assets that they sure would be hoping nobody's going to tell them your tank just blew up. So what are those assets that really give you pause and make you a little bit concerned? What do you do on a day-to-day basis to your assets to keep them in operation as long as possible? And then the flip side, how do you decide when and how to replace those assets? So what goes into making those decisions about your assets? We also want to know if we have enough money to address all of our operation and maintenance needs. Can you actually go out and do what it is you want to do to your utility? Do you have the funding for that? And then are you investing enough in asset replacement, and how would you know? So are you replacing your assets quickly enough to address the needs? So what we're talking about is really called asset management, that really involves knowing what assets you have, what you want them to do, which ones are the most important to doing that, how we can ensure that we're doing, that we're able to do all the things that we want to do all the time. In other words, keep that reliable service going at all times. And then do we have enough money to get it done? So we're showing the asset management in a line here, but it's actually a circle. It's actually something that has no beginning and no end. It's just always going to be taking place as you're operating your system. You will be doing asset management because it's just about getting started, knowing where you are, knowing what assets, that sort of thing. So it can start from wherever you are. The past is something that you learn from, but you don't let it keep you from moving forward in the direction that you need to go. So you just take the past as a given. It is what it is. They put whatever infrastructure in that they put in that you can't change, at least not overnight. So the main thing is just get started, just do it, and start from wherever you are. So we're going to dig a little deeper into those various core concepts of asset management. We went through them very quickly. Now we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about them. So the first one is really about your asset inventory and your maps. So in this component, we're trying to think about what assets you own. So what are those things that make up your system? So do you have any tanks? Do you have wells? Do you have fire hydrants? Do you have chlorine pumps? Do you have any meters? Do you have valves? Do you have pressure reducing valves? Do you have a surface water treatment plant? Any of those things. So what are those assets that make up your system? And you have to think about how deeply you want to go into those assets, because we don't want every nut and bolt in the system, but we do want all the major components. So we have to keep track of the major components that make up our system and what those are. We want to have some kind of inventory or listing of all these assets. That could be in any number of formats. There could be really simple inventory spreadsheets that you do on paper. There can be commercial programs that you buy. And then there can be, like the bottom there, an Excel spreadsheet. That's a freely available spreadsheet that we have on our website. You can modify any way you wish. It's just meant to be an assistance for people. You know, if you just want to get started with an Excel spreadsheet, there's nothing magic about ours, but it's just already created and makes it a little bit easier to get started. So there's a lot of different options for how you might want to store the information about your assets. So the next question is, what is that information? What do we want to know about the assets? So if we want to know what assets we have, we want to know a little bit of information about each asset. So some of the things you can collect, and this is not an all-exhaustive list of all the things you might want to know about your asset, but this is all the major things. We would want to know the current condition of each asset. You can do that very simply with words. It's excellent condition, very good, average, poor, fair. You can do it in numbers. It can be a 1 to 5 rating with maybe 1 being very good and 5 being very bad. So there's a lot of different ways that we can rate condition, but we want to be able to tell what condition our assets are in, because that will help us later on deciding when those assets need to be replaced, how good our maintenance program is, and that sort of thing. We want to know the useful life of each asset, and we'll talk in a minute a little bit more about useful life, so we'll hold on to that thought just for now. We want to know something about the maintenance and service history. So what have you done? Have you been doing routine maintenance? Have you lubricated your pumps? You know, what are you doing on your assets as a maintenance and, you know, part of your service history? What were the manufacturer's recommendations about maintenance for that particular asset? Do you have a plan to recondition, refurbish, or replace those assets over time? We want to know the location of the assets, and there's an example of a map to the right. Your map doesn't have to look like that. It can look very different. It just needs to be some way to tell where your assets are in the field or what building your assets are in. We want to have an asset ID, and we will talk a little bit more about that in a moment as well. And then there's a whole bunch of attributes that could potentially describe your asset, such as age, manufacturer, size, type, material, serial number, model number, horsepower. There's a huge list of things that you could do with each asset, and how many of those attributes you put in is really related to how much that information will help you and what type of asset. So you don't have to go crazy with the attributes, but you should put some descriptive information about each one. Replacement cost is another thing. How much would it cost you to replace that asset? That again helps you with information of how much money might I need in the future? And then the operational status of the asset. Is it operating? Is it in reserve? Is it a spare? Is it out of commission because it's broken? You know, what is happening there? We're going to spend a little bit more time on the maintenance and that piece of things a little later. For now, we want to move into the useful life estimate and what goes into that. Oftentimes, people think age is a really good way to tell how much longer an asset will last. It turns out age is actually not a good indicator at all. It is a piece of the puzzle, and if you know the age of something, you can certainly include it in your inventory. But it's not something to hang your hat on. What we really would rather do is take a look at each asset and say, given its current history, and you would know how much maintenance you're doing on the asset. Have you been doing a lot? Have you been doing a little? Have you been skipping it? What its current condition is, and anything else you know about the asset. How much longer do you think you could keep that asset working? Is it 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? That is your best guess at how much longer you can keep that asset working, and we call that our useful life estimate. And your estimate will be a really good indicator. So don't be afraid to go ahead and try that without thinking about, well, a pump should last 15 years and my pump is 12, so it only has 3 years left. If you do something like that, you will artificially shorten or lengthen the life of the pump. If, for example, the manufacturer said, well, you should get 15 years, but you haven't done any maintenance at all, you're highly unlikely to get all 15 years. If you've done a lot of maintenance, you've really kept up with it, you've really been faithful about what you need to do for your pump, you might get 20 years. So you won't take it out of 15 if it is only going to be good for 10 or if it would last for 20. So that's why we want to bring our own thoughts and judgments into this. And your operators, your maintenance people, they have the best knowledge of how much longer something's going to last. So they need to be heavily involved in the useful life estimate piece and getting them to say what their best guess is about how much longer something will last. And then I mentioned ID numbers. It's really important to give every every asset an ID number. It should be unique to that asset. It can be a random number, just, you know, any old number, or it can actually have something with letters or patterns of letters and numbers that tell you something about the asset. So you can see on the right-hand side, there's a tag that says V3104C, and the C might mean something to them, or it might just be a random number. You can use things like, if it's a pump, you can put P in front of it and say, okay, a P means that it's a pump, or a V means it's a valve. So you have all different ways that you can possibly do different kinds of asset ID numbers. It's just whatever works best for you. But every asset should have a unique asset ID number that stays with that asset from cradle to grave and never gets used again. So if you replace that asset, you give it a different ID number. And then it's really important to take pictures of your assets. And the things that are really, really important to take pictures of are any of those faceplates, nameplates on the equipment that have information like model numbers, serial numbers, horsepowers, the manufacturer's name, supplier names, anything like that that can help you go back and get information or seek out a person who can help you from the office. These nameplates, as you can see the bottom one, this is from a utility that we took a picture of. And that nameplate is already fading. It's very hard to read. Some of them are not readable at all by the time you get to the treatment plant. So the sooner you take your pictures, the better, because they are going to decay over time and become less and less readable. So get those pictures up front, have them at your fingertips in your computer with labels or connected to your Excel spreadsheets, however you want to do it, so that you have those pictures should you need to contact anybody or get more information. Today, there are pictures, you can take them any different way. They can be taken from your cell phone if you have a smartphone. They can be taken with a iPad or other computer tablet. They can be taken with a phone, a camera, a digital camera, and they're not very expensive these days. And that quality picture is plenty good enough for what you're trying to accomplish. If you don't already have a map, create one. And any kind of map can be helpful. So it could be like the bottom left-hand corner picture where it's just a bunch of lines on a piece of paper with push pins. The yellow push pins are valves and the red push pins are hydrants for this particular map. So it can be, you know, as sophisticated or not as you wish, but it will just help you go find your assets. And the more mapping you have, the better it is if an emergency occurs and you need to go out and look for your assets. There are a couple of tools available for you on our Southwest EFC website, and they are all free and available to you to use. If you have any questions about them, you can contact us at any time. We are happy to discuss with you how to use them or how to get them. One of the tools is the reference guide for asset management, and it gives you sets of data that you can collect on different kinds of assets. So for example, on pumps or tanks or wells, we have a whole set of these that give you ideas about where to look for the data, what kind of information to get, what might be very necessary, what might be optional. So that will help you with your inventory process. And as I mentioned, we also have that inventory spreadsheet. So this is kind of the big picture, and then just zooming into a little bit, you can see the types of things that are included there. That is downloadable off our website as well, and it's just to get you started. You can change it any way you wish. If you want to add columns or take columns away, you can do that, but it's just a way to get you started on the whole asset inventory. The second component is level of service. In this component, we're trying to remember that utilities are customer service businesses. And so it's really important for us to understand what our customers want so that we know we can provide it to them. So we really would like to have some goals that say, what are we trying to do? How promptly will we respond to a customer complaint? Or how many water main breaks will we tolerate? Or what kind of regulatory compliance are we after? So setting goals for how you're going to work with your utility to deliver what the customers want. So goals allow for the conversation of what happens when you don't meet the goal. So if something goes awry, you haven't met the goal, now we can talk about, well, why didn't we meet that goal? What is it that we need? Do we need more funding? Do we need a different operator? Do we need training? Do we need equipment? And without a written goal that you can measure, those conversations don't really happen. So the goal setting really helps us dig into what it is we're trying to do and what to do if we can't make that happen. Again, we have a tool available on our website. It's a level of service guideline, categories, and example goals. So this goes into goals that you can set. They're already written, and then they have little boxes that are in gray that'll be the target levels, and all you have to do is change the target level to whatever you want it to be, and you can adopt any of the goals that are in the level of service guidelines. So it's a good way to get started. You might pick out 3 or 4 of the goals just to get going, and then over time you don't need a lot of goals. Probably 8 to 12 goals would probably do it for most utilities, especially smaller utilities. And again, you can pick off the list the goals that make sense to you and your customers, and that's a good way to get started in the goal setting. The third component is your critical assets. So that was that question I asked before of, what are you hoping if you get the call in the middle of the night? What things are you hoping they're not going to tell you? So the way we figure out critical assets is we look at the assets that are likely to fail. So what's the likelihood that any given asset will fail? And what's the consequence if the asset does fail? If we plot that and we say, okay, the probability of failure is on the bottom axis, and the consequence of failure is on the vertical axis, any asset that is very likely to fail, and it's really bad if it does, will end up in high risk. Any asset for which we don't really expect it to fail, but if it did, we didn't care, that's your low risk assets. Your moderate risk assets either are very likely to fail, but it doesn't matter, or they're not very likely to fail, but it would be really bad if they did. The reason we go through an exercise like this is because we want to be focusing our money, our personnel, all of our resources up in the higher risk category and not down in the lower risk category. So the more effort we put here to try to prevent a failure of our assets, the better our utility will run, the more impact we will have, and the more likely we will be able to sustain ourselves in any emergencies and give reliable service. The way we typically do it is we rank the probability of failure from 1 to 5. So 1 is an extremely low probability that that asset will fail. 5 is an extremely high likelihood that the asset will fail. And then there's 2 through 4 in between. And then we do the same thing for consequence. Extremely low consequence if the asset fails is a 1. Extremely high consequences if the asset fails is a 5. And you just think through things there of, would there be a public health and safety concern? Would there be a reliability concern? What will happen if that asset actually fails? Will it be bad? Will it be moderate? Will it be terrible? Will it not be bad at all? And then we take the values. So maybe probability of failure is a 2 and the consequence is a 3. We multiply them together to get the criticality or risk. So if we had a 2 here and a 3 here, our risk would be 6. When we get done with that, we could plot our assets again on the chart that I showed you before. And if you use a scale of 1 to 5 for probability and consequence, you end up with risk varying from 1, which would be down at this bottom corner, to 25, which would be up at the top corner. So all of your assets could be plotted on a chart like this, and you could say, well, which are the assets that are really high risk? That's where I need to be putting my maintenance dollars, my replacement efforts. That's where I really need to be focused to try to reduce that risk. We again have tools available. There's a couple of them. Another part of that reference guide talks about what types of information you would want to look at to judge your probability of failure and your consequence failure. So there's a sheet for every type of asset where you can kind of look through it and say, well, what are the types of things I should look through to think about that 1 to 5 ranking for probability and consequence? And then we have another tool that it kind of allows you to say, okay, what is the asset name and what is the date I'm doing this? So if I have a probability of 4 and a consequence of 3, what is my overall risk? So there's also this criticality form, and then it has the table as well that you can plot your assets on. The third component is life cycle costing. Life cycle costing is when we want to consider the entire life of the asset. So all the way from design to construction, operating, maintaining the asset, and then when it fails, repairing, rehabilitating, and ultimately someday replacing that asset. We're not going to focus a whole lot on the design and construction at this point, but understand that that's where everything starts. So if you have a really good design and really good construction, that will help you maintain assets for a much longer period of time. But we're going to jump in right at the point where you've designed and constructed the assets, and assets are now in the operational phase. So when we're in the operational phase, we're going to turn equipment on and off. We're going to open and close valves. We're going to make sure pumps are running. We're going to make sure the chlorine is in there. It's those basic things to keep the water flowing to your customers. We're also going to do maintenance, and I divide maintenance into 3 different categories. Different people might use different terminology and different categories, but these are the ones that I choose. The first one is routine maintenance. That's the regular activities you do, the everyday inspections, routine things that you do. Preventative is when you start to see that asset go bad and you want to try to intervene to keep it from getting worse. So a preventative maintenance activity might be, I hear the pump making a noise. I'm going to get in there and do something about it before the situation goes crazy, before that pump actually fails. Or maybe you see it's a motor and it's running really hot. Something's wrong with it. So you try to get in there before it's really completely collapsed. And then predictive maintenance is trying to estimate when something that you don't want to have happen will happen. So when will a pump fail? Well, you might monitor the lubricant. you can actually send the lubricant off and have them monitor how much metal fragments are in the lubricant or something like that. And they can try to give you a predictive analysis to say, hey, it looks like your pump is wearing really well. You probably got several more years. Or your pump is wearing very poorly. You probably have to replace it right away. So predictive analysis is really trying to get after some monitoring information so that you can tell when a failure may occur. One question I like to ask people is, if someone maintained an airplane the way you maintain your facility, would you fly in it? And this is a way for you to really think about how you're doing. So if somebody is really not doing a very good job of maintenance and it's really iffy whether you're going to be able to keep up with the utility and provide that service and keep everybody safe, then you really want to think about it. So if the answer is no, then it's a good sign that you probably need to make some improvements in your maintenance program. And I've had people push back and say, well, an airplane is really important. A lot of people fly, it's very bad. And I say, there are over 300 million people that drink water from drinking water systems in the whole country. We impact 300 million people a day. If you fly in an airplane, there are thousands of people flying every day, but not 300 million. So really, we are more important to keeping the health going than anything else. So we really want to think about ourselves as a public health organization. There's 5 questions that you can ask yourself about maintenance. So what maintenance activities do you do? How do you do them? When do you do them? What do those activities cost, and what impact do they have? So these kinds of questions help you make decisions about whether the maintenance activities you're doing are the right ones. Are they having the impact you want? So maybe you're doing a lot of oil changes, but the pumps are still wearing out. Then perhaps you're using the wrong lubricant, or you're not doing it properly. Maybe you need to change procedures. So you can actually examine what you're doing and how you're doing it to see what impact it's having and make adjustments as you need to. Where might you go to get help on what maintenance to do? There is another publication. We've developed, and I'll show you in a minute just what the book looks like, but it's a preventative maintenance for small public water systems guide. It's generally for groundwater utilities more so than surface water, but there are aspects, if you are a surface water system, there are still aspects of that you can use. There's also manufacturer's information, and there are actually places you can go online to find help, or to find out where to get these operation and maintenance manuals online. You can also use data and experiences from past activities. This is an example of that book that I mentioned. It's something we developed for the EPA, and it sits on EPA's website. It uses Adobe Acrobat, so you need to have Adobe, but you can get that for free. And then here is where you can get it. You can get it on EPA's website. If you search for small public water system resources or something like that, you can find it. Or you're always welcome to look at the link here. You can download the entire package. You can download individual files, so different parts of the utility. And then this was developed out of the older black box information that EPA had, which was quite literally a black box that had note cards in it. So you can actually get that older black box there as well. So there's 3 different options for how to go through manufacturing, operation and maintenance practices, and what you should be doing. So remember the information required for asset inventory under the new regulations. So there are a couple of pieces here: the maintenance and service history, manufacturer recommendations, and plan to recondition, refurbish, and replace. So that maintenance and service history, you can use that guide that I just showed you from EPA to help you with that maintenance and service history piece. You can try to tie that to manufacturer recommendations to see what the manufacturers say, if it's different than the book. And then finally, when assets break, you need some kind of plan to refurbish them. So anytime an asset fails, you can always do a repair, replace, or rehabilitate type of option. And you want to think about, when do you want to make each of these choices? When should I replace? How much is that going to cost me? How much would a repair cost? and then ultimately creating a plan on when you expect to do each asset. So looking at that useful life again, if I think my pump is going to last 3 more years, I'm going to have to replace that asset in 3 years, or refurbish it, or do something with it to keep it in running order. This is an example of a capital improvement plan, a really simple one. So the year that the item is needed, what asset it is, the number of assets that are needed in that year, how much the cost is total. You can also lump things into 5-year increments if it turns out that you want to have a whole bunch of assets replaced over the years, or you want to have a longer term plan. You can kind of lump things together to say, well, over the next 5 years, I need this much money. The last part really gets into the funding, the long-term funding, what money you need to run your utility, and do you have enough money now to replace your assets? Do you have enough money to run the facility? Webinar 2 is going to go more into the financial end of things, rate setting, that sort of stuff. So stay tuned to Webinar 2 for more information about the funding. So as a wrap-up, there are requirements related to asset management. Lori talked about those. There is a checklist that you can get from the state of Connecticut that talks about what you need to do. And here's sort of a closer up view of that checklist. And it gives you some information of different resources that are available to help you. So these are different resources than we showed you today. So our website, the Southwest EFC website, has additional resources to help you with asset management. And also, we are available to help you. So the Southwest Environmental Finance Center has a contract with EPA, which is paying for this particular project. And that contract, in addition to allowing us to do things like this webinar, will allow us to help individual utilities. So if you need help with something, if you want to know how to get started, if you want to know how to use a particular tool, if you just have questions, how do I do an asset ID number? How do I make a map? Any of those kinds of things, please reach out to us. In the next slide, we'll have some contact information for 3 of us at the Southwest EFC. There are other folks to help as well, but here's 3 different contact names. And there will be a poll question at the end as well, where you can indicate that you would like to have assistance. So we're very willing to help. I know the regulations might seem daunting at first, but it's really meant as a process to help you first and foremost. And yes, there may be requirements, but it's more about you. So Tess, with that, I'll see if there's any questions from anybody. If you have any questions, you can type them into the dialog box, the question dialog box. And Tess, I don't know if any have come in while we've been speaking.
Sure. Yeah. So it looks like 1 or 2 questions are in. I can give everyone just a couple more seconds to get those questions in, Heather, and we can actually go ahead and maybe give our technical assistance poll. And that way, for anyone that's knows now after seeing this presentation that they really do need assistance, you can let us know right here and we will follow up with you directly. So looks like a couple people have responded. I'm going to give you a few more seconds for everybody to get your response in here. Looks like almost everybody has. I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, and then just quickly to close up before we get to our questions, I wanted to ask everyone about our blog. Like we said in the beginning, the Environmental Finance Center blog has a lot of lessons learned from past technical assistance or trainings and success stories related to asset management and other topics. So if you would like to subscribe, you can let us know here. Okay, and it looks like everybody's pretty much responded, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. Okay, with that, I think some of these questions are better maybe answered by Lori because they're very particular to Connecticut. So Lori, are you still able to answer some questions?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So the first question, would a church fall under the category of a water distributor?
Say that again. I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Sure. The question is about if a church would fall under the category of a water distributor?
I would think that the question would be, could a church be a public water system? And the answer to that is yes. And if that individual would like, it depends on if you serve 25 or more people, 60 days out of the year. Some churches have daycares, which makes them a public water system automatically if you have 25 or more children. But again, it's population based and it's the amount of time based. And if there's a question about determinations of your particular instance, please give us a call. You can certainly email me directly with any questions that you have. You might have about a determination and whether or not we have a lot of systems that are really very small, and they have those questions about, boy, I only have 20 people here, or I only have 12 people here. Am I really a public water system? Or my business model has changed and no longer I don't have this business or that business. Does that really make me a public water system? We get those questions all the time. And so we absolutely would love to chat with you and talk to you about whether or not you fit the category of a public water system or not. But it's defined under the federal law, what a public water system is. So we'd be more than willing to have a conversation about the definitions and how your particular instance fits within and under those definitions.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, looking like there are a few more people typing in questions at the moment. Heather, I think this question is best posed to you. What tools besides the black box and a PDF might be available for somebody just getting started with asset management, and how can you pick which kind of tool would work for you?
And that's a really good question. There are a lot of tools out there, and I say start as simple as possible to get going. There's lots of on-the-market tools that you can buy that bill themselves as asset management, and they're really just information storage devices. So you can buy a program that holds a lot of your asset inventory data, but the truth is, asset management is really the thought process. It's really thinking through, literally walking around your utility and saying, what assets do I have? So when I'm doing an asset inventory, usually we'll try to do phone apps. There's a lot of really good phone apps right now, and you can actually put an app on your phone that will allow you to collect data. There's a lot of them out there. We are not endorsing any, but one that we've used a lot is Fulcrum. FLUCRUM, and it's just a way you can create a data entry sheet, and you just go around and you fill in drop-down menus, and you can walk around your whole facility. There's a lot of other ones, so I would say find a really simple way to collect the data. If a piece of paper works better for you, create a little form on a piece of paper where you say, well, I'm going to put the name of the asset, what information do I want, and have somebody walk around. And we like to walk around with operators and go visit every piece of equipment you can see and get a picture, write the information down, the assets that you can't see. You do the best you can to estimate if it's pipe, anything that your operators know about that pipe, write it down. What size is it? What type of pipe is it? Where do you think it is? Take pictures, record your operators. I mean, that's really the simplest way to start, is with the asset inventory piece. We do have an asset management guide on our website, AM Can Work. It's a guide we wrote back in 2011, 2012, and that's available for free on our website, and that walks you through the process of asset management. You're welcome to look at that. EPA has quite a few resources available on their website as well. Look for the simple stuff. Do the really simple stuff first. Do the map, do your asset inventory first. That's the best place to start. As far as like operation and maintenance, the black box tool that we talked about is a good way to put like maintenance activities, but Colorado state also has a really good operation and maintenance guide, and they walk you through it. Theirs is really simple, and I really like theirs. So if you just Google Colorado Operation and Maintenance Guide, or operation and maintenance plan. They have a really good step-by-step, easy to follow guidelines. So there's a lot of really good resources out there. Err on the side of simplicity. Make it simple, keep it usable for yourself, and that will help you get going.
Okay, I think we are just about at the top of the hour, so we're running out of time here. We did just get a couple questions for asking for more information about the hydropneumatic tank webinar. So I can say that we will be sending you information about that as soon as possible. And Heather, do you have anything else to add about that webinar?
Not a whole lot other than stay tuned. That one will talk about the requirements for the hydropneumatic tank. And then we'll also cover water loss on that webinar. So it'll probably be, I'm guessing, late January, early February, somewhere in that time frame. We haven't yet set the exact date. So we will get with Syracuse. We'll be putting the dates together, and then we'll make sure everybody gets all the information about webinar 4. So it'll be at least another 6 weeks probably till we have that webinar. So stay tuned there, but we'll make sure you get noticed about that webinar as soon as we get that scheduled.
Great. And just to reiterate, the next webinar is going to be on January 8th at 4 p.m. on rate setting and funding. And that will be with Glenn Barnes from the UNC Chapel Hill EFC. And so feel free to register for that at our website, efcnetwork.org. With that, Heather, and Lori, I'll let you close out this webinar with a few comments.
I'll just say thank you, everybody, for being on today. We really appreciate your listening in. And just a reminder that the webinar will be uploaded and the recording will be available. So if there's anything you want to listen to again, I know we covered a lot of information quickly. So if there's anything that you'd like to hear again or you want somebody else to listen to it, please feel free to listen to the recording. It'll be up in a couple of weeks. And then please reach out if there's help that you want getting started. You know, please send us an email or fill out the form online or whatever, and we'll get back to you. If you filled out our poll on today's webinar, we'll get back to you and try to help you however we can. And Lori?
Hi, thanks, Heather and Tess. Again, I really want to thank the Environmental Finance Center and Heather, great presentation and a great way to try to simplify you know, what will be a requirement. And I want to emphasize that we're all here at the water systems that are online today. We're here to provide assistance and help and training and help to guide you through this process. We really appreciate the work of the Environmental Finance Center, and I very much appreciate the 14 or so public water systems that have stayed on the line and have listened to this webinar over the last hour. It's really very important concept, asset management planning, as you've heard, and financial planning is an important aspect of remaining a sustainable system for the future and a sustainable, resilient system for the future. So again, thank you all for listening.